listener production.
Hey, it's Helen Smith here with you. Welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, you've probably heard people call US President Donald Trump a fascist leader lately, including in our interview with Rosie O'Donell earlier this week.
And with what happened to Stephen Colbert and Jimmy Kimmel, although, America stood up and said, no, Disney, not on our watch. You don't get to be the American family company and then support an active fascist in the White House.
So, what is fascism and what makes a political leader a fascist one? That's coming up. First though, let's check the afternoon headlines. It's Wednesday, the 8th of October. Rental prices have risen by almost 44% in 5 years, according to a new Cotility review. The median rental price across the country has risen to nearly $700 a week for the first time, with prices going up by 4.3% nationally in just a year. Over the last 5 years, it works out to be an extra $204 per week Australians are paying to keep a roof over their head, with Sydney topping the list where the average price is more than $800 a week, followed by Perth, Brisbane and Darwin. The review also found there are fewer rentals on the market, with only 1.47%, or about 1 in every 68 properties available to lease, which is less than half the pre-COVID average. It's been revealed Optus sent out an alert about their 000 outages to the wrong government email address, leaving the messages undetected for more than a day. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese says the telco has to do better.
The independent investigation will be undertaken, and we need to make sure that the failure by Optus in this case doesn't happen again. It's as simple as that.
It comes as legislation for a 000 custodian has now been passed. The bill is set to make the system safer and more resilient. But the Greens say we need a full-blown parliamentary inquiry into the Optus 000 outage, which resulted in the deaths of 3 people after a 13-hour outage left Australians unable to call for help, impacting over 600 calls. And Sam Kerr is expected to play her first game for the Matildas after almost 2 years. The Australian superstar is set to join her teammates in upcoming friendlies against Wales and England. Kerr hasn't played for Australia since November 2023, at the height of the Matildas' frenzy, after suffering an ACL tear during a Chelsea training camp back in January 2024. Now it's time to get into our deep dive with Dr. Marco Durante, a senior lecturer in European and international history, on fascism, looking at what the signs and red flags are of a fascist leader and if we're seeing a resurgence of fascist tendencies worldwide, and whether or not we should be throwing around the word so lightly when it comes to current political leaders, i.e. Trump. Marco, we've been hearing the word fascism being thrown around a lot lately. What is fascism?
Well, let me start off by saying there are many, many different definitions of fascism depending on the historian you talk to or the political scientist whom you ask. I'll give you a mouthful, if I may. I'm going to define fascism as a brutish, xenophobic, ultra-nationalistic, populist movement that glorifies the leader and seeks to impose an authoritarian regime through total mobilization and control of the population.
So I'll get down to kind of when the term was first coined. When did that happen? But more importantly, when did we start connecting it to political leaders?
Well, fascism emerges in the aftermath of the trauma of the First World War, this catastrophe that consumes Europe from 1914 to 1918, which is known as the first total war in Europe. And we call it a total war because it required that total mobilization of the population. The war was won not just on the military front, but on the home front, and required a massive expansion of the powers of the state and the intervention of the state in domestic affairs. And it also required a massive mobilization of both civilians and soldiers alike. So what we see is the birth of totalitarianism really comes in this First World War. And so out of the ashes of the First World War, out of that kind of mechanized murder that we see on the front lines and the broken peace that followed, we see the seeds of fascism emerge.
People have been calling Trump a fascist leader since he took office. What does being a fascist leader mean?
When we talk about fascism, I think we have to think comparatively, right? Both in terms of fascism at the time, the two regimes that we, of course, associate most prominently with fascism being that of fascist Italy under the dictator Benito Mussolini and Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler. And there are many, many similarities between these regimes, which is why we can come up with this generic term, fascism. But there are also many differences. And I think that's really important to think about when we use the word fascism today, that we don't need a contemporary fascist leader to map on exactly to the attributes, say, of a Mussolini, of a Hitler. Let me also say that fascist leaders out of power are not necessarily the fascist leaders that we see when they're in power. But if I was going to describe a fascist leader, I would describe a messianic figure or someone who in their own mind is a messianic leader who claims to represent the people, leading a kind of revolutionary mass movement. We see someone who wants to create a kind of cult of personality around themselves, someone who is a populist who is appealing to the will of the people and seems to embody the will of the people over, say, kind of liberal institutions that we would associate with liberal democracy, such as, parliamentary democracy and the rule of law and the courts and so forth, which the populist leader then affiliates with the elite and kind of creates this tension between the people and the elite. That elite could be the financial elite. It could be an intellectual elite. It could be a media elite. But what's really interesting about fascism as a phenomenon when it first emerges after the First World War is that it's a right-wing movement, but it appropriates elements of left-wing movements. But in theory, it's also a kind of, anti-capitalist against these big financial concerns and industry and elite, representing the little man. Say the little man, a little woman today, but it's a very macho, highly masculine, toxic masculine movement as well. The leader has this charismatic authority that is almost a kind of chaotic force. But I think we can see a lot of those attributes attached to Trump, certainly, if we want to look at similarities. We can look at the cult of personality around Trump. We can look at his populism. We might even say there's a kind of revolutionary, anarchic element to Trump. And we certainly saw that in the insurrection that occurred towards the end of his first term. In practice, fascist leaders often accommodate elites. They're very anti-elitist in their rhetoric, but they often are actually kind of, being backed by different kinds of elites. But I also think when we think about fascism in comparison, are we trying to diagnose fascism like a doctor would diagnose an illness, look at different kinds of symptoms and say, hey, if you have, 5 out of 7 of these symptoms, then you have this condition, right? Or are we thinking of fascism as something that's a symptom of a democracy in crisis, a democracy in decline that undergoes certain kinds of stages and evolves over time and kind of metastasizes over time and doesn't necessarily end where it started?
Trump aside, experts are claiming that we're seeing a resurgence of fascist tendencies worldwide. What are some of those signs that we could be looking out for?
Well, I think if we want to think of fascism in terms of stages, the first stage is a general sense of pessimism and decline. And there's been a lot of talk about the impact of globalization on advanced economies in the West and the hollowing out of the middle class and the skilled working class as a result of economic globalization. This increasing sense of anxiety, whether it's anxiety among young people, the anxieties that people feel in terms of the cost of living, for example, and housing, a sense that earlier generations had a better standard of living than them. a loss of kind of hope, what we would call a breakdown of this liberal narrative of progress, which I think was really important to the rise of fascism in the 20s and 30s. So we see today as well a sense of this, and we think about Trump really casting a narrative of decline, talking about the wreckage, kind of that has laid waste to the U.S. and much of the working and middle classes of the U.S. because of globalization, for example. Sense within Europe as well of this pessimism and anxiety all over, including Australia and well beyond, about people's financial well-being, and then also a sense of cultural pessimism and a sense that one's own culture is under attack by foreign influences as well. And so this is a really key kind of first stage, is this general kind of anxiety, sense of decline, this pessimism. That doesn't necessarily mean that because you have that general atmosphere that then you're going to see the emergence of fascism. Then after that, we have to think, okay, so is there a movement that in some ways resembles fascism, at least, or elements of it, that can take root in certain sectors of the population, that can gain a kind of mass following? And where does that start? So in some countries, that can start within certain kinds of social classes. Typically within Italian and German fascism, it was long said that it was the lower middle classes that were really the first base of fascism, that sense of the kind of white-collar worker, the small shopkeeper being squeezed between kind of the great industrial interests on the one hand and then the working classes and trade unions on the other. There's also elites that are drawn to fascism, often out of fear of revolution from below or discontent from below, a fear to their own interests. And then the next stage after that is, can this movement become politically viable? And we saw within Nazi Germany and fascist Italy that the fascist movements, when they tried to become political parties, were spectacularly unsuccessful in the beginning. In the case of Germany, it was this spectacular collapse of the German economy and the world economy with the Great Depression that allowed the Nazi Party to gain steam. And then there's what happens when the fascist party comes to power. How are they able to seize power? How can they consolidate power? And then there's the radicalization of these fascist governments, these fascist regimes, and their eventual ability to become a kind of totalitarian, that all-encompassing totalitarian regime, and kind of radicalizing in terms of their ambitions, whether it's war, the kind of exclusion or destruction of the other within their societies, and so forth. So if we think of fascism in terms of stages in a kind of stadial way, that allows us then to step back by having to kind of map every feature we see in Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, and kind of in its most mature, ripe form, in terms of how these regimes were by the late 1930s and the Second World War, onto, say, a Donald Trump or Viktor Orban or Vladimir Putin or other figures we see who are not in power right now.
Coming back to Australia, is fascism on the rise here?
I think culturally, the Australians have more an aversion to that kind of spectacular, theatrical, chaotic, authoritarian, charismatic figure. We just don't see, for all the accusations of authoritarianism, maybe, thrown against Scott Morrison recently because of the controversies surrounding him. And, we kind of see these terms thrown around, but I think there's more of an aversion to that type. You can look in Italy, for example, and see a figure like Silvio Berlusconi, you could see as a kind of precursor to Trump. Italians also having to deal with their own figure who was a real estate magnate, who then was a media, had a media empire and media personality. But a place like Italy was ripe for that kind of movement. But I don't see that happening as much in Australia, but it's hard to know. And also because these aren't just isolated cases. There's transnational influences. What happens in the US, what happens in Britain bleeds over into Australia. But of course, we have very scary episodes, and there are on the fringes, these very far right elements, and we've seen recently with concerns about immigration. Obviously, there is a kind of growth of anxiety growth of resentment that is helping the rightward fringes on the Australian political spectrum.
And what role does social media play in spreading or combating fascist ideology today?
With social media, there's, just like with fascism itself, there are these contradictions. It's once a kind of highly individualistic, chaotic force, a force that could be used for democratization or even for kind of revolution for the purposes of the left as much as the purposes of the right, a much more democratic mass phenomenon. But it also can allow for the spreading of these conspiracies and taking advantage of these anxieties that people feel and allowing these movements to engage in their propaganda against the internal and foreign enemies, against elites, that can give a lot of fuel to those movements and create that direct connection between the charisma of the leader and the people. And I think, you see companies now and individuals who have increasing control over social media and those algorithms that are constantly being tweaked behind the scenes.
And finally, how do you combat fascism?
I'll talk about the elites because I am part of what the populists call the elite, right? But I think one thing is for elites to assume responsibility for their failures. The elite have failed in many respects to address people's needs, to address people's anxieties. So it's the responsibility of the elite to really try to remedy and rectify that base first stage of fascism, right? And to kind of recreate that trust and identification and, really get a sense and have a kind of empathy and an empathetic connection with people's concerns. I think what people get hung up with in academia is one version of truth, which is factual truth, veridical truth, which is what we talk about all the time. Only if we can just educate people enough, if people were just educated, that they somehow would not be under the thrall of these populist charlatans and the thrall of all these conspiracies and so forth. But that's not enough. I think that's a very paternalistic, often condescending view. And to understand that people follow these movements, people vote for these leaders, often for rational reasons. We may not agree with all of them, but they have their reasons for why they think these leaders are representing their interests, representing their values. And that has to be taken seriously if we want to prevent them from having our societies tumble down that abyss.
Marco, thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
That was Dr. Marco Durante there, a senior lecturer in European and international history. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'd love you to subscribe wherever you're listening to this from, and why not leave us a rating and review? It's a really easy way you can help support everything we do here at The Briefing. And you can follow us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. We'll be back in your feed tomorrow morning. I'm Helen Smith. Catch you next time.